I propose here that reality and consciousness are very nicely described by the processes of emergence and complex systems. I think that chasing this line of reasoning, one can amend many problems in philosophy, including questions related to dualism versus monism and determinism versus free will. Let's leave aside those issues for right now and discuss the core general notion. Emergence occurs when a complex system has properties or behaviors that its parts don't have on its own and emerge only when they interact in a wider whole. Basic examples include how a single molecule of water isn't wet but a pool of water is. A complex system is any set of interacting parts that produce collective behavior not found in its individual parts or components. Some examples of complex systems include things like flocks of birds, a city, even climate. In a flock of birds, each bird keeps distance, aligns directions, avoids collisions. From that, the group changes direction instantly, and large-scale shapes appear. Predator evasion becomes more effective. The flock self-corrects. A city is millions of people, and none of the residents individually contain the city's behavior. But consider, together they generate traffic patterns, cultural clusters, slang, economic cycles, supply routes, service patterns, commuter flows. These are examples of emergent properties from a large set of interacting, individual, unique components or parts of a complex system, the city. All of these are classic cases of emergence. Each system transmutes tiny local behaviors into something vast, organized, unpredictable. This is why emergence is a powerful frame for consciousness, and why a brief explanation of emergent properties is vital to explaining my own philosophy. I say that consciousness is very well described as being an emergent property from a complex system. In our human experience, it appears consciousness most commonly comes about from biological, carbon-based complex systems, but I wish to avoid going into a tangent on the nature of which types of systems generate consciousness. Let's focus on the general idea for right now. Our most common and obvious example of what kinds of complex systems generate consciousness are, as said, biological ones, our own anatomy, genetics, brains, etc. I also think that all of reality is, in a way, describable in these terms of emergence and complexity. There are emergent properties in complex systems found at the most fundamental levels of physics, from particle interactions to chemical interactions to ecosystems, astronomy, and planetary systems. Complex systems themselves are not new ideas, but I think that this fascinating subject can potentially answer a large handful of some of the biggest questions in philosophy when taken from its scientific roots and used in analysis of, as mentioned, determinism and dualism. These are only two of the conundrums in philosophy from the handful or so I think this view answers. To answer determinism, or the notion that all reality adheres to physics, and physics is deterministic, therefore free will is an illusion, the entire issue is resolved when we view consciousness, and by extension free will, as an emergent property in nature, and this is how mind can be entirely composed of physical material while consciousness still exists within the physical world. But its free will isn't merely some illusion, it's merely a emergent property from a complex system. It springs forth from the material world, but then violates the laws of the material world, a determinist may ask. But consciousness doesn't violate anything in this view. It's simply, like I say, an emergent property, and some of its abilities include being able to manipulate itself, its bodies, its nervous system, mind, etc. In the same way, giant sums of interacting unique components act in radically new ways compared to their individual parts, and this solves the disconnect between empirical data of materialistic, mechanistic, deterministic behavior and lived experience of personal agency. But emergent properties still adhere to the law of physics, a determinist may say. There are many emergent properties that adhere to the systems that constitute them, but there are also many, in my view, not just consciousness, that actually do in fact create the rules of reality. And this sounds completely strange and absurd, but I think it becomes reasonable when one considers the laws of physics themselves can be described as emergent properties. Consciousness isn't violating physics by having causal power. It's operating at the same ontological level as physical laws themselves, which is to say, having causal power. Both are emergent properties that gain reality through the organization of their constituent parts, and this dissolves the hierarchy problem where consciousness seems less real than physics. Consider thermodynamics emerges from statistical mechanics. Chemical bonding rules emerge from quantum interactions. The critical points where matter suddenly changes state emerge from collective behavior. New systems with new properties that come about from complex systems. A determinist may say, you still haven't explained how emergence grants causal power that escapes determinism. You say consciousness can manipulate itself, but, well, that manipulation itself is determined by the prior states of the neurons, which were determined by prior states, on and on. The determinist objection assumes that causation only counts if it exists at the lowest level. But I think that assumption is the key mistake. Emergent systems have causal powers that are fully grounded in lower level physics, but not reducible to simple particle level descriptions. there are higher level patterns that constrain, organize, and redirect the organization or behavior of their parts. Consider software. Now, every action a computer takes is implemented by electrons shifting in circuits. A strict reductionist may say only the electrons in the circuits cause anything, but that misses something obvious. The program running on the machines does determine what the electrons will do. The code isn't just a ghost floating above the hardware, it is a higher level pattern made of physical states, and that pattern changes and channels how the lower level states change. The causal power of the program is real, even though it's fully physical. Change the software and the electrons will behave differently. The macroscopic pattern constrains the microdynamics. Now, that might seem a little bit far-fetched, but consider at a more natural level a single water molecule. It doesn't undergo a phase transition when it's changing from, for instance, ice to water back and forth, but a collective of them does. Once the structure forms, that structure restricts the motion of each molecule. The macro phase dictates micro behavior. You cannot reduce ice to a big list of molecular coordinates and get a usable causal explanation, even though ice is perfectly deterministic at the micro level. A living cell emerges from countless biochemical reactions, but once the cell membrane and regulatory networks are in place, they restrict which organizations can occur and how often. The emergent organization, in a way, starts to change the rules of the game. A hurricane is an emergent structure made of billions of air molecules, but once the vortex forms, it imposes a massive organized motion on these molecules. The large-scale pattern becomes a physical constraint that directly, literally moves around its individual constituent parts. In other words, emergent properties altering and interacting with its unique parts is not a new idea in nature. But how exactly does an emergent pattern gain powers its substrate doesn't determine? Downward causation? Macro patterns constraining micro behavior? A determinist might say that this doesn't address the standard objection that those macro patterns are themselves determined by prior micro states. Again, I feel this objection is answered when one considers emergent systems having causal powers fully grounded in lower level physics, but not reducible to simple particle level descriptions. More directly answering this particular objection, strong emergence does exist in nature, in my view, not just consciousness, but, for instance, as I said, the laws of physics themselves, and I know that this is a major claim needing major evidence, or at least some justification. The default intuitive view is that the laws of physics are the bedrock of reality, unchanging fundamental rules upon which everything else is built. But is this truly a given? There is at least one argument, I think, for why viewing them as an emergent property is a very well potentially more coherent view than otherwise. Consider this. The strength of gravity, the charge of an electron, if they were even slightly different, the universe would be a sterile soup of simple particles. No stars, planets, or much else that we know of. It would be a completely different universe. Why are they set this way? A scientifically interesting explanation is that they are the result of a deeper evolutionary process. In this view, the universe's laws are not necessarily set in stone axioms, but potentially better viewed as stable, self-perpetuating sets of rules that emerge from more fundamental, chaotic primordial states. They are not the foundation, but the outcome of a kind of cosmic evolutionary process. Next, consider chemistry. The periodic table with its laws of valence and bonding allows us to make incredibly precise predictions about how molecules will form and react. And you could say that this is all just weak emergence reducible to equations for every electron, but the law that an oxygen atom forms two bonds is not a property of a single electron. It's the property of a complex system, a nucleus and 8 electrons, that has reached a stable configuration. This law then acts as a real constraint on how that system will interact with other systems, and it's a new rule that appears at the level of atomic organization. It is not a description of the parts, it is a rule for the whole. But could you really have guessed that any of it would have happened from the isolated review of its components? I argue that the laws of physics are the ultimate version of this. We observe phenomena in nature that are best experienced by a hierarchical layer model of reality where new rules emerge at higher levels of organization. So strong emergence is a general feature of how reality is structured. Calling consciousness strongly emergent is placing it in a category of other fundamental features of the universe, like the laws of chemistry and thermodynamics. So again, consciousness is merely operating at the same ontological level as the physical laws themselves. Both are emergent properties, gaining reality through the organization of their constituent parts. Consciousness is of the same creative, self-organizing dynamic that produced physics in the first place. Now, on to another example of a philosophical issue. I say this view, consciousness, being describable as an emergent property, can swiftly resolve. Dualism. Dualism mistakenly assumes consciousness must be non-physical because it seems so different from matter. Dualism is, in a completely oversimplified way for briefness, the notion that mind and matter are inherently separate, as if two different realms, merely interacting. I shouldn't need to explain how my view disagrees with that. Consciousness only seems radically different than common energies and matter, but it really isn't. Consciousness springs from matter, exists in the physical world, and its will, soul, or as I may call it, internal perspective or consciousness, also exists in the physical world. And I already explained how free will can exist without violating physics. Higher order emergent properties display influence over their parts in nature. Personal daily lived experience points to free will existing strongly as well. I find it reasonable to believe that, yes, it comes about alongside consciousness as an emergent property, not in violation of the laws of physics, but alongside them. So consciousness only seems to be otherworldly or ethereal or to violate physics, but it doesn't. It's simply a new phenomena that comes about from certain complex systems. But most people feel there's something fundamentally different about consciousness compared to other emergent properties. I argue that no, there isn't. The bare existence of anything, matter or consciousness or etc., is just as mythical and unbelievable as anything else's bare existence. I see nothing harder to believe about the existence of a consciousness as I do the formation of patterns in the activity of particles and energy, or the existence of those particles and energies in the first place. If consciousness emerges from complexity, well, at what point? Does a worm have it? A thermostat? At what point it develops an internal perspective is the exact point that it becomes conscious. To be absolutely clear, there's not saying that any complex enough system becomes conscious. Consciousness is an emergent property of a certain type of complex system. It has nothing to do with how complex it is, and more or less complexity does not mean more or less consciousness. Consciousness is binary, in my opinion. It either has qualia, an internal sense, or it does not. I only speculate on if something is conscious, not how consciousness it is. Firstly, to answer the question of what is or is not conscious, we ought understand that we only have our own selves to look towards and guess as to others' consciousness based off perceived similarity. I try to use a kind of inference of functional similarity to myself to gauge the likelihood of consciousness in other creatures. With certainty, my own consciousness, I gauge then with very high confidence other humans and animals, with moderately high confidence odd animals like octopi who still have clear behavioral indicators of preference, learning, pain avoidance, etc. Uncertain am I regarding simpler organisms like viruses. Novel possibilities like AI or even weirder candidates like gods or imaginary friends have no biological similarity to anchor the inference, so there's no easy way of testing those similarities. It's hard to gauge at all. The point is, to start, we begin from solipsistic roots and must infer consciousness only by similarity. We take a similar leap in logic for practical ease of living when we assume the existence of, well, anything beyond ourselves, including the physical world. Focusing back on testing for consciousness, simply asking if something is conscious or not, I think it's the same as asking, does it show signs of having an internal experience? A thermometer responds to temperature but shows no indication of experiencing or preferring anything. A scale reacts mechanically with no signs of internal standpoint. A microbe shows preference somewhat. It approaches nutrients, avoids toxins, suggesting to me enough evidence that I personally am convinced. I'd likely do the same thing in its situation. An octopus has clear emotions, problem-solving ability, a personality, strong indicators of qualia and experience. An AI could potentially show these signs, but it's harder to judge because the substrate is very alien. It would require behavioral signs of genuine preferences, emotional responses, and qualia indicators, treating experiences as having subjective quality. The challenge is distinguishing simulation from instantation. Consciousness emerges from specific complex systems architectures. Biology is the only confirmed generator, but that might just be sample bias. We infer consciousness in other systems based on behavioral signs of internal experience, qualia, preference, emotion, and the more similar the manifestation to our own case, the more confident the interference. In review, consciousness is an emergent property of specific complex systems, primarily biological brains. It arises when physical components interact in particular configurations, creating properties that the individual parts don't possess, similar to how wetness emerges from water molecules or colony intelligence emerges from, for instance, ants. Consciousness is real and material, but a novel feature of the whole system. Base components may follow deterministic physical laws, but consciousness as an emergent property has agency, a new capability. Free will exists as a feature of the complex system itself. This, in a way, can be seen as monistic, that is to say purely physical. It's non-reductive, that is to say it views consciousness as both physical but novel, and dispositionalist, that is to say emergent properties do possess genuine causal powers that shape reality.